Back in the mid-1930s, Europe saw a sudden revival of interest in twin-engine fighters. These were designed for 2 or 3 crew members. While similar aircraft had appeared earlier, they had not gained much traction. The reality was that military strategists of the time believed the primary mission was intercepting enemy aircraft. They felt this was handled much better by light, cheap, and highly maneuverable single-seat, single-engine fighters. Because of this, the development of heavy, long-range fighters was largely ignored for quite a while. But that changed when the design of these powerful aircraft got underway. This happened almost simultaneously in several countries around the world. All of these new designs were heavy, twin-engine monoplane fighters. They were intended for a wide variety of combat missions. For instance, in 1934, engineers in the German city of Augsburg went to the drawing board. They set out to design an aircraft that would eventually go down in history. This was the famous Messerschmitt Bf-110. Meanwhile, over in Amsterdam, work began on the future light air cruiser. This was the Fokker G1. And in France, in October of that same year, the Air Force Technical Service ordered the development of a 3-seat fighter. It was supposed to be armed with powerful forward-firing cannons. This aircraft was meant to intercept aerial targets and escort bombers. It would even act as a lead aircraft to command formations of light, single-seat fighters. Right away, no fewer than 8 French design bureaus entered a tight race. They competed against their German and Dutch counterparts. The military requirement for a triplace de chasse concept, which translates from French as a 3-seat fighter, led to a lineup of truly fascinating aircraft. Among them were the Potez 630, the Henriette 220, the Loire Nieuport 20, and the Romano 110. However, the most innovative and advanced of the bunch was the Breguet 690 fighter. It was developed by a talented team of engineers led by Georges Ricard. It was an incredibly rugged and genuinely beautiful combat aircraft. Just a few years later, aviation experts would call it the lightweight predecessor to the legendary British Beaufighter. The main visual feature of the Breguet 690 was its incredibly short nose section. The aircraft itself was a mid-wing monoplane. Its wing was mounted directly into the center of the fuselage. Inside the lightweight but sturdy duralumin fuselage, 3 crew members were comfortably seated. These included a pilot, a navigator, and a radio operator gunner. The firepower of the fighter was also impressive. It featured 2 20mm Hispano-Suiza cannons mounted in the fuselage. They were positioned on either side of the pilot seat. The rear arc was protected by a 7.5mm MAC 1934 machine gun. This was placed on a flexible mount. The wing of the aircraft was an all-metal, cleverly engineered design. It had removable leading and trailing edges, making field maintenance a whole lot easier. It was split into 2 halves. These were securely bolted to the main fuselage frame, right between the crew compartments. For flight control, it used metal-framed ailerons covered in standard aircraft fabric. It also used pneumatically operated flaps. The tail section followed a similar design. The elevators and rudder were also fabric-covered. Powering the aircraft were 2 14-cylinder air-cooled radial engines. These were the Hispano-Suiza 14AB-02 and 03. At takeoff, each engine produced 650 horsepower. At a rated altitude of 11,480 feet, that number climbed to 680 horsepower. The engines spun 3-blade Hamilton standard propellers in opposite directions. This made the aircraft much more stable in flight. The fuel system held 186 gallons, and this was logically distributed. 2 54-gallon tanks were housed inside the wings. 2 39-gallon tanks were located in the engine nacelles. The large main gear wheels retracted straight back into those nacelles. Because of its long main gear struts, the aircraft sat with a steep nose-up attitude on the ground. This gave it a very distinctive profile. Assembly of the first experimental Breguet 690 prototype began in Villacoublay in 1935. However, the official military contract was not issued until March 26, 1937. By this time, the aircraft was already nearing its first flight. Around the same time, the technical service of the French Air Force began drafting requirements for an ideal attack aircraft. There was a deep divide within the military leadership. The conservative camp of generals stubbornly held on to outdated doctrines. Specifically, they favored Italian General Giulio Douay and his theories on command of the air. Fortunately, chief designer Georges Ricard was much more forward-thinking. From the very beginning, he designed the Breguet 690 with the capability to strike ground targets. As a result, his engineering team quickly drew up preliminary blueprints and calculations. Their goal was to evolve the fighter into a heavy two-seat ground attack aircraft. This new version was optimized for close air support on the battlefield. Construction of the first prototype, the Breguet 690-01, had already progressed so far that converting it into an attack aircraft was impossible. Doing so would have severely disrupted the testing schedule. Therefore, the engineers decided to leave the aircraft in its original fighter configuration. As it turned out, however, that compromise was in vain. The problem was that priority for Hispano-Suiza engine deliveries had been given to the mass production of a completely different aircraft. This was the Potez 630. Thanks to this bureaucratic red tape, the promising prototype sat in a hangar for 10 full months waiting for its engines. It was not until March 23, 1938, that the chief test pilot for Breguet, Maurice Claes, was finally able to take the aircraft up for its maiden flight. 4 months later, the Breguet 690-01 was sent off for official state trials. During these tests, the Breguet design demonstrated clear superiority over its rival, the Potez 630. The new aircraft boasted excellent flight characteristics. It was highly responsive on the controls and exhibited impressive maneuverability. However, it was not without its flaws. The oleo struts of the landing gear proved to be too fragile for operational loads. Because of this, the prototype had to be temporarily sent back to the Breguet factory at the end of August. This allowed the design team to resolve the issues. Interestingly, even before the official state trials began, the factory test results for the Breguet 690-01 were highly impressive. Because of this, the military decided not to wait. On June 14, 1938, the government placed an order for an initial batch of 100 aircraft. These were in the two-seat attack bomber variant. This version received the designation Breguet 691 AB2. Over the next few months, military requirements grew. The order was increased to 204 aircraft. That being said, this decision sparked major arguments. It also faced fierce pushback from certain high-ranking officials at Air Force headquarters. These conservative officers stubbornly refused to admit that the military even needed a specialized aircraft for ground attack missions. Turning the basic design into a full-fledged attack aircraft turned out to be a relatively straightforward job for the engineers. The biggest change was completely removing the navigator station. It originally sat right between the main wing spars. Instead, they built a dedicated bomb bay. Here, 8 50-kilogram bombs were stacked vertically in a special rack. The forward-firing nose armament was scaled back slightly. This left just a single, powerful 20mm Hispano-Suiza 404 cannon. They mounted it on the right side of the forward fuselage. The pilot fired it using a Beyle-Lemaire 40 gun sight. This equipment also doubled as a sight for accurate dive bombing. To boost firepower, they paired the cannon with two 7.5mm MAC 1934 machine guns. An interesting engineering feature was that the cannon and machine guns could be depressed by 15 degrees for strafing ground targets. This capability made aiming much easier. On top of that, they installed a fastened 20 reconnaissance camera right in the nose. To defend against enemy fighters attacking from the rear, they mounted a flexible 7.5mm MAC 1934 machine gun. It was located in the rear gunner radio operator station. It sat on an Alcan 220 mount. This was later swapped out for an Alcan 224. Another identical machine gun was fixed firing downwards and backwards. This weapon covered the aircraft blind spots. Compared to its predecessor, the Breguet 690-01, the new attack variant was slightly longer. This was because its nose was extended by about 1 foot. The engine mounts also had to be lengthened by nearly 9.5 inches. This modification was absolutely critical for maintaining the aircraft's center of gravity and preserving its handling characteristics. Engineers also significantly increased the shock absorber travel on both the main landing gear struts and the tail wheel. The tail wheel itself was noticeably enlarged. The oil coolers were previously housed in the wing leading edge. They were now relocated beneath the engine nacelles. Cockpit access changed as well. Instead of the previous sliding glass canopy, the canopy halves on the new version folded outward on hinges. To extend the aircraft range, they pushed the total fuel capacity to 260 gallons. They achieved this by fitting additional 37-gallon tanks inside each engine nacelle. The first 100 Breguet 691 attack aircraft were slated to receive reliable Hispano-Suiza 14AB-10 and 11 engines. These power plants produced 700 horsepower on takeoff. They maintained 725 horsepower at an operating altitude of 10,660 feet. For subsequent production airframes, they prepared upgraded engines from the same series. These were the 14AB-12 and 13, which were optimized specifically for low-altitude combat. Takeoff power was bumped up to 800 horsepower. At an altitude of 2,130 feet, they delivered a steady 745 horsepower. As for the props, the first 50 aircraft were fitted with Breguet 1447 and 1448 propellers. However, starting with airframe number 51, they transitioned the fleet to the more efficient Hamilton Standard 1311 and 1312 propellers. Breguet management did not waste any time. They quickly got a full-scale production line up and running for the Breguet 691. The pace was genuinely impressive. Less than a year after signing the contract, the first production example rolled off the assembly line. In fact, the first production aircraft was designated Breguet 691 No. 1. It lifted off just 8 weeks after the Breguet 690-01 prototype made its maiden flight. The prototype took to the air on March 22, 1939. Remarkably, a fully functioning production aircraft was already flying by May 15th. By late August, a newly formed combat squadron arrived at their base in Orleans. Later in October, French pilots officially accepted their first batch of 5 brand-new Breguet 691 attack aircraft into service. The Hispano-Suiza 14AB engine had a very compact profile. This gave the aircraft an excellent power-to-drag ratio. But the initial optimism of the engineers quickly faded. In practice, the engine fell far short of its expected service life. They just could not overcome the persistent teething issues of the design. The overall reliability of the power plant remained unacceptably low. Hispano-Suiza was pouring almost all of its resources into developing liquid-cooled engines at the time. Because of this, there was little chance these flaws would ever be ironed out. The designers made a radical decision. They decided to swap out the Hispanos for Gnome Rhone 14M radial engines. These had an even smaller diameter. While still on the assembly line, one of the Breguet 691 attack aircraft was quickly modified. It was updated to take a pair of the new engines. These produced 700 horsepower on takeoff. They also produced 660 horsepower at just over 13,000 feet. The updated aircraft was now designated the Breguet 693. It began its flight trials in late October 1939. Just a month later, it was transferred for official state testing. The handling and performance of the plane remained largely unchanged with the new power plants. Because of this, the Breguet company received a clear directive. They were to halt all production of the previous version. Moving forward, all new attack aircraft would roll off the line exclusively with the Gnome Rhone engines. They would be produced under the Breguet 693 designation. By the spring of 1940, the first production airframes of this type took to the skies. Engines aside, the updated Breguet 693 was virtually identical to its Breguet 691 predecessor. The internal equipment and armament were exactly the same. However, on slightly later production blocks, the designers added a unique defensive feature. They installed extra MAC 1934 machine guns. These were cleverly mounted in the rear of the engine nacelles. This allowed them to defend against fighters attacking from behind. With demand growing, an additional order for Breguet 693 production was placed in neighboring Belgium. This took place at the Sabca aircraft plant. The plan was for this facility to build 9 airframes specifically for the French Air Force. On top of that, the Belgian plant secured a contract to build 32 units of the next variant. This new variant was the Breguet 694, intended for the Belgian Air Force. But the outbreak of war abruptly intervened. The rapid German occupation of the country derailed these ambitious plans. This happened before a single aircraft could be built. As for the Breguet 694, it was a dedicated tactical reconnaissance variant. It was based on the proven Breguet 693 airframe. The crew was expanded to 3, yet the aircraft retained its multi-role capability and it could still fly ground attack missions. Development of this variant began in the summer of 1939. This followed a direct request from the Swedish government. They later ordered a batch of 12 aircraft. The Breguet 694 was designed to be powered by 2 Gnome-Rhone 14M engines. These provided 710 horsepower on takeoff. They also provided 680 horsepower at around 13,000 feet. The center fuselage reverted to the layout of the original Breguet 690 prototype. Specifically, the designers brought back the dedicated observer station. This gave the crew member room to operate a vertical camera for reconnaissance. Armament, however, was reduced. They kept just 1 fixed machine gun in the nose. This was paired with a single flexible machine gun in the rear cockpit for defense. Ultimately, the Swedish order for the Breguet 694 was cancelled, but the project was not shelved. The Belgian military took a serious interest in the design. They favored a slightly modified version with much heavier forward-firing armament. This turned the aircraft into a true multi-role platform. It became capable of operating effectively as either a 3-seat reconnaissance plane or a fast 2-seat bomber. The first experimental prototype made its maiden flight in early 1940. By the summer, it was officially handed over to naval aviation. At one point, Navy leadership even considered an ambitious plan. They wanted to place an initial order for 100 Breguet 693 attack aircraft for their coastal units. Interestingly, back in 1939, France implemented a strict contingency policy. The government mandated that all combat aircraft be designed or adapted to accept alternative American or British engines. This was purely a precautionary measure just in case the enemy managed to bomb or disrupt French engine manufacturing plants. Following this directive, the decision was made to equip one of the initial Breguet 690 prototypes with a pair of American-made 14-cylinder twin-row radial engines. These were the Pratt & Whitney SB-4G Twin Wasp Jr. This resulted in a new experimental prototype. It was officially designated the Breguet 695. This American power plant produced an impressive 825 horsepower on takeoff and 750 horsepower at a critical altitude of around 9,000 feet. On top of that, the Pratt & Whitney was actually lighter than the French Gnome-Rhone. But there was one major drawback. Its overall diameter was a massive 44 inches. This was roughly 20% wider than the original French engine, 37 inches. This severely impacted the aircraft aerodynamics by significantly increasing parasitic drag. Plus, it was physically impossible to squeeze the bulky American radials under the tight-fitting cowlings originally designed for the compact Gnome-Rhones. This created a major challenge for the engineers during installation. The engineering team had to completely redesign and significantly lengthen the engine mounts. Because the new American engines were lighter, they had to be moved further forward of the wing leading edge. This was done just to maintain the aircraft center of gravity. The engine nacelles themselves also required a major redesign. The new, much wider cowlings created a glaring problem. They severely restricted the pilot lateral visibility. On top of that, the increased drag caused the aircraft top speed to drop by about 6%, and its takeoff and landing performance degraded slightly. Ultimately, due to all these technical compromises, the Breguet 695 never earned the popularity and respect among military pilots that the earlier Breguet 693 enjoyed. A contract for an initial batch of 15 Breguet 695s was signed on July 27, 1939. Just 5 weeks later, on September 2nd, military leadership decided to significantly expand the order. Despite the technical flaws mentioned earlier, flight testing of the baseline version concluded on March 3, 1940. It was officially deemed a complete success. The following month, on April 23, the very first production standard Breguet 695 made its first flight. By the first week of July, these new aircraft began entering active service with the 18th Aviation Division. The base airframe of this aircraft proved to be incredibly versatile. It was easily adaptable for a wide variety of combat missions. Furthermore, its rugged construction and excellent aerodynamics allowed engineers to continually equip the aircraft with increasingly powerful engines. Thanks to this winning combination of traits, a wide array of experimental variants and interesting modification projects were eventually developed. Even in the very early stages of the aircraft development, chief designer Georges Ricard was actively exploring the possibility of installing more powerful engines. He looked at the French-built Gnome-Rhone 14N14-cylinder twin-row radial engines. These power plants could put out 980 horsepower at an operating altitude of around 14,800 feet. This promising project was given the working designation Breguet 692. Naturally, the boost in flight performance from the extra thrust would have been a great fit for this aircraft. However, the massive diameter of the new engine came in at almost 51 inches. This required such an extensive redesign of the entire airframe that the idea had to be scrapped. Ultimately, this ambitious modification never made it off the engineers' drawing boards. For the next model, the developers decided to radically change the aircraft main role. The new version was designed as a two-seat light bomber. It was based on its predecessor, the Breguet 693. Designated the Breguet 696, this bomber was equipped with Gnome-Rhone 14M engines. It also featured a slightly larger bomb bay. Now it could easily hold 4 100-kilogram bombs. Alternatively, it could carry 2 larger 200-kilogram bombs stacked one above the other. To drop this destructive payload accurately, the bombardier radio operator used a special Bronzavia periscopic sight. This sight extended right through the floor of his cockpit. As for defensive armament, the forward-firing machine guns were reduced to just 2 7.5mm barrels. Rearward defense was still handled by another identical machine gun on a flexible mount. The first experimental prototype of this bomber successfully took to the skies on November 3, 1939. The French Aviation Consortium factory in Bourges even received urgent orders. They needed to prep all the necessary tooling and equipment for mass production of the Breguet 696. But the war dictated its own terms. Military command gave absolute priority to attack aircraft. Because of this, production of the light bomber was completely canceled. This marked a strategic shift in favor of the new Breguet 697 attack model. Mass production of that version began at the same factory in the spring of 1940. Even though the Breguet 692 project never materialized, the engineers did not give up. On one of the experimental Breguet 671 airframes, they finally managed to install those highly desired Gnome-Rhone 14N engines. These put out an impressive 1,070 horsepower at 7,200 feet. These experiments were part of a massive program to create the Breguet 700 heavy two-seat fighter. The first sketches for it appeared on the desks of Georges Ricard's team back in mid-1939. The test aircraft with the powerful new engines was given the working designation Breguet 697. It made its maiden flight on October 19, 1939 at the Villa Coublay airfield. During test flights, the airplane showed an absolutely phenomenal boost in climb rate. It reached a top speed of 354 miles per hour. Inspired by this incredible success, the military ordered 2 full-scale prototypes of the Breguet 700 fighter on February 17, 1940. Unfortunately, the engineers only had time to build a full-scale wooden mock-up of the future fighter. All further work was abruptly cut short by the rapid German occupation of France. To keep this unique technology out of enemy hands, the experimental Breguet 697 had to be completely destroyed. According to the original plan, the final Breguet 700 fighter project was supposed to be based on the standard Breguet 690 airframe. However, its arsenal would have included an extremely powerful forward-firing 30mm cannon. Based on the designer's optimistic calculations, this Predator was expected to reach speeds of over 370 miles per hour at an altitude of around 13,000 feet. Another interesting project that never made it into production was the Breguet 698 BP-2 two-seat dive bomber. It was designed to meet the exact same French Air Force requirements as the Potez 6313. Engineers planned to fit it with the same reliable engines used on the Breguet 693. One particularly interesting feature was its dive brakes. They utilized specially designed ailerons that worked on the exact same principle as the famous German Junkers system. This design choice actually had some unexpected consequences. Later, during the occupation of France, the Gestapo arrested the designer of the aircraft, Georges Ricard, on orders from the Reich Aviation Ministry. The Germans were determined to find out if this dive-brake setup was the result of French industrial espionage. Another planned variant was the Breguet 699 B-2 bomber. Essentially, it was just the Breguet 696, but powered by American Pratt and Whitney twin Wasp Jr. engines. However, just like the previous project, this bomber never made it past the drawing board. The final variant of the base Breguet 690 family that Georges Ricard managed to design was the Breguet 810. This was a two-seat carrier-based attack bomber. Development kicked off in the fall of 1939 in response to a new government contract. Externally, the fuselage looked a lot like its predecessors. However, it featured one major modification for naval service. It had folding wings to save precious deck space on an aircraft carrier. The design team also added landing flaps and a tailhook for arrested carrier landings. This naval bomber was slated to be powered by Gnome-Rhone 14 M45 engines. In October 1939, French combat squadrons began transitioning to the new Breguet 691 en masse. These attack aircraft quickly became a massive hit with pilots. The crews were highly impressed with their flight characteristics. On the ground, however, the aircraft had a rough reputation among maintenance crews. The biggest headache was the poor reliability of the Hispano-Suiza engines. The landing gear was also a constant source of trouble and required frequent maintenance. By the spring of the following year, during another reorganization of military units, the air groups started receiving the upgraded Breguet 693 models. Right before active combat broke out in May 1940, over 24 of these new aircraft were already sitting on the flight line at forward air bases. They were ready for action. The true baptism of fire for these attack aircraft came on the evening of May 12th. 11 Breguet 693s sortied to strike German military columns near the Belgian town of Tongeren. There, they flew right into a wall of heavy anti-aircraft fire. The German flak was devastating. 7 aircraft were shot down right in the middle of the raid. Another attacker took so much damage it crashed on landing. Yet another was forced to belly land in a field. Only 2 aircraft managed to limp back to base. One was so badly shot up it was written off as a total loss. Another French air group flying a similar mission nearby with 7 Breguet 693s had much better luck. They lost only a single aircraft. Meanwhile, down in the south of France, other crews were still in training. They were trying to get up to speed on the new Breguet 693. However, the lightning-fast advance of the German panzer divisions forced frontline units to fall back. To make up for the devastating losses, High Command had to throw every available reserve into the fight. One of these air groups was hurriedly transferred north, even though the air crews had not fully transitioned to the new bombers. This led to a highly unusual situation during a combat sortie on May 20th near Arras. Older Potez 633 trainers ended up flying in the exact same formation alongside the brand new Breguet 693s. That day, 14 aircraft carried out a joint strike on enemy positions. Just 2 days after that mission, the obsolete Potez 633 trainers were finally retired from frontline service for good. Overall, the Breguet 693 saw mixed success in combat. When they managed to catch the enemy by surprise, losses were minimal. But after a disastrous mission on May 12th, Command began actively looking for safer tactics. The best results came from a 45-degree dive attack. Pilots would start the maneuver from an altitude of around 3,000 feet. Then they would drop their bombs at roughly 1,000 feet. To approach targets undetected and avoid anti-aircraft fire, the planes flew at extremely low altitudes. They were literally hugging the terrain. French pilots continued flying desperate combat missions right up to the armistice. They were constantly falling back under enemy pressure and hopping from one airfield to another. By May 25th, pilots had flown around 500 combat sorties. They lost 47 aircraft in the process. The sturdy and reliable design of the Breguet 693 saved the lives of many crews. These planes often made it back to base, even after taking heavy damage from intense flak. On top of that, repairing the aircraft was surprisingly simple. Thanks to smart engineering, a complete engine swap took just 1 hour and 20 minutes. Without this incredible ease of maintenance, keeping the aircraft combat ready would have been impossible. This was especially true since the fast-paced nature of the war forced units to constantly shift their forces between airfields. In practice, the armament of the Breguet 693 proved highly effective. However, one major issue became obvious in combat. The Gnome-Rhone engines only delivered their peak power above 13,000 feet. This is exactly where a serious mistake by the French Air Ministry became glaringly apparent. Even though the Breguet 693 was purpose-built for low-altitude attack missions, officials somehow failed to insist on using a version of the Gnome-Rhone engine optimized for low-level flying. Production of the entire Breguet 690 series had to be abruptly halted when German troops advanced on Villacoublay. Just days later, the enemy reached Bourges. Up until that point, the main plant at Villacoublay managed to assemble 224 Breguet 693s and 50 Breguet 695s. Due to severe equipment shortages, only 106 and 33 of these aircraft, respectively, actually entered service with the French Air Force. Another factory in Bourges managed to roll out 30 additional Breguet 693s. One of the last planes built there made its acceptance flight on June 9, 1940. This happened right before the fall of France. After the armistice was signed, most French air groups were completely disbanded. However, the newly formed Vichy government was allowed to keep a small air unit of 26 aircraft. This unit was based at the Lézignan airfield. A few Breguet 695s were part of this remaining fleet. But in November 1942, when German forces occupied the rest of Vichy France, all surviving aircraft were seized. The Germans transferred some of these planes over to Italy, along with others found mothballed in storage. There, the Italian Air Force used them exclusively as trainers for their new pilots.